Hello, you're very welcome joining me for the last of my three reflections on Pope Francis's book, Let Us Dream. Last week, I spoke about the see, judge, act principle of looking at a situation and sort of seeing what's happening, weighing up what needs to be done, and then moving on to what can we do and what should we do. So the chapter 3 of Pope Francis' book is called A Time to Act. And I realize that at one level, what he's talking about is very much a kind of pipe dream, a nirvana, or something that lies well into the future and may not be evident or visible or achieved in our lifetime. But at the same time, because he's spotted signs of good things that are happening, he sees this as part of the progress towards where we should be. So while all is not as it should be, some things are. And the only thing that you and I can do is, at our own domestic level and a bit beyond it, be part of that process that is working towards change. And it's not like a plan that has to be achieved in a certain number of years. But I suppose Francis is looking at almost the other way round. It's what things will be like if we don't act differently in relation to the world around us, our environment, but also in relation to ourselves. So we start from the point that this book is about life after the pandemic. And that's one of Pope Francis's greatest desires, that after the pandemic, life and we will be different. We'll be changed people when we come out of it. Not perhaps very obviously or very dramatically changed, but hopefully because of what has been happening in these last 12 months, a coming together of things which we have treasured and valued in these difficult days that won't just become part of our memory and our story, but will be part of our present as well. So I suppose in simple terms, he's looking forward to a continuation of the generosity and the selflessness that has been evident in so many places in the world and closer to home. And some of the things he talks about are perhaps more problematic elsewhere, but there's nonetheless plenty to think about for our own country and our own locality. I suppose when it comes to action for the future, time to act, Francis is right in expressing his fears, the anxieties he has about an unchanged world. And one of those fears is what he calls the competition for dominance, the sort of dog attitude that's found in so many walks of life. And we don't just mean big business. We don't just mean in the world of high finance. We mean in everybody's desire just to be masters of their own destiny. And that can operate at a very self-centered level in certain individuals who are, at the end of the day, just really concerned with their own survival. So he says that this kind of competition for dominance approach, this approach makes life difficult for everybody ultimately. His concern for the environment, which is so evident in Laudato Si, his encyclical on the environment, when he challenges the practice of powerful people who tend to seize and extract all that they can from the world around us. And just because they're powerful, they believe they can do it. They have the power or the money to, as it were, rape and pillage the earth and not worry about the consequences. But Francis holds very strongly to the principle that the world and the land in which we live is the rightful possession of the whole of humanity. Nobody has a right to wreck it or destroy it or let it go to pot on our behalf. He sees this, of course, in the context of the scriptures and of God's dealings with his people, because God entrusted the care of the world to humanity from the beginning. There's no getting away from that. We as human beings, able to name things, by that very naming, are taking responsibility for giving to the whole of creation the dignity it deserves. But we have a power that nothing else in creation has to do even that. He entrusted the care of his world to us all. And there are problems when seas have depleted stocks of fish, once fertile lands are barren, a reversal of the scriptural vision when the barren lands will blossom. Forests have disappeared. Some of the devastation that has happened cannot, unfortunately, be put right, or be put right easily, or be put right quickly. And he shares that concern that in some situations it may be too late, because global warming results in changing sea levels, in melting ice caps, and forest fires. Pollution of the oceans harms the fish. Rape of the land wipes out wildflowers and plants and threatens the lives of numerous species of insects and birds, and indeed larger creatures. You only have to see a naturalist talking nowadays to tell us how many fewer species of what were once common insects and birds and animals are now effectively extinct, if not across the world, but certainly in localities. But Francis, with his eye on the bigger picture, doesn't simply talk about the world around us and our care of it. He talks about us humans too. And he says that everything negative in the directions regarding the earth, all these disasters and calamities, end up by unmasking the vulnerability which we humans share. They just succeed in exposing our superficial securities. As long as we've had cans and plastic bottles and bags to dispose of, then we've done so. But then it reveals our vulnerability, our insecurity. and he sees humanity at its best all the time in the way in which it responds to suffering, which has been so evident in so many directions in the last 12 months. And those kind of positive actions can help to restore human dignity. It can also help to recover our memory and remember our roots. Because something that is so precious, when it's taken for granted but then threatened, can become precious again. We go back to that comment I made last week or the week before about how significant a cup of coffee with somebody will turn out to be. And we've seen examples of that, haven't we, in the last couple of days in the news, where friends have sat at either end of a park bench over a cup of coffee and just enjoyed time together. And outside of the pandemic, of course, other events have helped to galvanise action. Though it seemed whenever we switched on the TV and watched the news that almost the only preoccupation for months and months and months was coronavirus. What was happening or not happening in our hospitals, how our healthcare workers were working their socks off and giving their all, how they were exhausted, how there were wonderful stories of deeds done by old men and by young children, how many people were contracting the virus, how many were in hospital, how many were dying. There's no doubt that it has and still does really dominate in many ways the news that we watch and hear about. But other things have happened that have made a difference as well. And one of the things that he highlights is the brutal and unwarranted death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Because the great thing that emerged from that was the Black Lives Matter movement and its coalescence, which has made people aware of their fundamental values. And the fact that Black Lives Matter is not just made up of Black people or people of colour from other parts of the world. That's not what it's about. Don't know if you recall that rather touching incident where a very, very elderly Baptist pastor was speaking at George Floyd's funeral back in the Deep South. And this pastor had been part of sort of human rights campaigns over the past 50, 60 years, and been, alongside Martin Luther King and Jesse Jackson and leaders like that. And he said, the one big change I have noticed is that 50 years ago, these marches were made up of Black Americans. He says now, these marches are made up of people of every shade, of every conceivable ethnic background, and every religious or non-religious affiliation. And so even something like that, he sees as being progress that's been made. And yet we're aware of the other side of good and bad existing alongside one another. You may have seen Panorama on yesterday evening, when it's quite clear that racial issues and racial tension are still alive and kicking, and that parents of black youngsters have to tell their sons and daughters to be very careful in all their comings and goings and in all their movements, because they will be targeted if they're seen in a particular place at a particular time when perhaps they shouldn't be there, and they will be targeted if others get away with it. So he sees that side, that's part of what he sees as a continuing problem. And then on the other hand, you have the wonderful way in which young children in school, don't worry in the least about the different colours around them. It doesn't make any difference to them because it's normal. And it's normal in a way that was not true even a few decades ago. Trevor Phillips, who was the chairman of the Race Relations Board, came to this country from the West Indies when he was still a very young child. And Trevor Phillips did not grow up in, parts of London or big cities where there was a large West Indian or African population. He grew up in a leafy and small country town, I think in Oxfordshire or Buckinghamshire. And he tells the frightening story of the time when, as a paper boy, doing his rounds, he knocked on the door of those to whom he delivered papers at Christmas in the hope that he might get a little Christmas box or a tip or a mince pie or a few sweets or something. He said, the pickings were actually quite good for 12-year-old paper boys. Of course, paper boys hardly exist now. But he told the story of going to the door of one house in a nice street of well-kept gardens and nicely painted houses. And the lady of the house answered the door, and he said, Merry Christmas. She said, just wait there, I'll be back. And she came back with her 3 children, and she just pointed at black Trevor Phillips and said, see, I've told you about them. That's what they look like. Thank God that the children in our schools today are not isolated from the world in that sort of way. So we see good and bad. We see the problem is still there, but we also see that other people are taking things naturally in their stride. But the story of God's dealings in the past with his people in the Old Testament, with Abraham and Moses, is the story of a God who is ever close, always walking beside his people. And that closeness is, of course, exemplified in the life and ministry and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because Jesus, among other things, apart from reaching out to those on the edge, apart from dealing with tax collectors and sinners, was also into the business of forming communities. He didn't want people to be isolated. He gathered people around him. A friend of mine who was an editor of a theological journal said to me once that he wrote an editorial in his magazine in which he said, if you can sum up the Gospels in one word, he said, my word would be crowds. Because he said, everywhere Jesus went, there were crowds. But he also pointed out that crowds did not necessarily mean that they went with Jesus all the way. Crowds could be curious, crowds could be persistent, crowds could be welcoming, crowds could be baying for his blood. But from those crowds emerged the followers, the people who came together, the people who may have been part of a small church to begin with, but were the beginning of something that was much bigger. And the pandemic itself has showed us that we are not saved alone, whether it's being saved from illness and disease or salvation in the bigger sense of the word. Because if all treatment were based on merit or on money, so many more would have gone under. And even as it is, those who've given much and are appreciated for their giving are also sadly undervalued. Francis takes this notion of crowds and community to his conclusion. He says we must accept the principle of solidarity, or we will not emerge from this crisis any better for it and any better for what we've been through. And he reminds us that emerging from the pandemic is something much more than keeping the virus at bay. The world he sees on the other side of this is a better world, an ideal world. He says in the Spanish language there are 3 words that begin with T that sum up the same 3 words which in English begin with L: land, lodging, and labour. We have a right to inherit the earth, the land around us. Every human being has a right to a roof over their head. Every human being has a right to worthwhile labour and reward for that labour. So, once again, I'm afraid it's been my take on what Francis has written. I said last week you may not agree with it, or all of it, but I hope if you've read it, that somehow it's been a source of strength and inspiration and a really good Lenten devotion for you. And that's why I said last week, and we'll do it next week, we will have a Zoom meeting when those of you who have been reading the book can yourselves gather with me and just share your own reflections on it, because I'm sure there will be a wealth of reflections that are very different from mine, and that, just by sharing them, by coming together, by being a community that has shared something in reading, we will benefit from it. So I will send out a link, as I will for the coffee and chat thing at the end of this week. I'll send out a link very shortly or in the next few days for this, and hope that some of you will join me. But I would underline what I think I said last week. I think it is important that whether if you've read the hard copy or read an e-copy of it on Kindle or something else, I think it's important that you will have read it, or at least read some of it, because otherwise you're simply sitting in on something which maybe has taken a bit from what I've said, but doesn't actually distill your own thinking and thoughts. So So I look forward to that because I think it should be, even if it's only just a handful of us, it should be a very worthwhile kind of exercise. So thank you for joining, whether it's been for 1 week or 2 weeks or for all 3 weeks. And you know, it's still not too late to read the book because you can get through it in a couple of hours without much difficulty at all. Thank you and God bless.